We have a new advocate, Dr. Bucephalus. His exterior offers few clues to the time he used to be the battle charger of Alexander the Great. However, anyone familiar with his background will not fail to notice certain things. On the stairs recently, I saw a very simple court servant watching our advocate with the appraising eye of a regular racegoer, as, raising his thighs mightily, he mounted the marble steps with ringing strides. On the whole, the bar approves of Bucephalus. With remarkable insight, people tell one another with society ordered as it is today, Bucephalus is in a difficult situation, and for that reason, and for his historical role, he deserves compassion. Today, to state the obvious, there is no Alexander the Great. Admittedly, some people know how to kill, nor is the adroitness required to murder a friend with a spear across a banqueting table wholly a lost art. There are plenty of people who find Macedonia too small, and they curse Philip, his father, but no one is capable of leading us to India. Even then, the gates of India proved unattainable. Though the king's sword was pointed in the right direction, today though these gates are altogether elsewhere, and higher and more distant. No one points the way. Plenty hold swords, but merely for the purposes of waving them around, and the eye that seeks to follow them will only be confused.
I have arrived at St. Mark's Square, at the far end of St. Mark's Basilica, and the tomb of St. Mark himself. And you may ask yourself, why am I so interested in the tomb of St. Mark? Well, there is a delicious theory going around out there that it might not actually be the tomb of St. Mark, and it might actually be the tomb of Alexander the Great, otherwise known as Alexander of Macedon. It's not a crazy conspiracy theory, this one. This one is actually quite plausible. There's some quite compelling, strong evidence to suggest that, at the very least, it's plausible that it's Alexander's tomb and not St. Mark's. It's plausible. And as important as St. Mark is to a lot of people, Alexander is far more important and far more influential. Sorry, but he is. Alexander is maybe in the top 5 most influential human beings that's ever existed. In terms of Western culture, he is, the chief commander, so you might say. He influenced more other figures in history that built Western civilization than anyone else, I would say. And that includes the Christians, actually. There's no Christianity without Alexander. There just isn't. You know, he was, whether he's great or not, we can discuss in another video. But influence, he is a top 3, top 5 figure in history.
The tomb of Alexander the Great, one of history's most significant lost archaeological treasures, was last recorded in Alexandria, Egypt, around the 4th century AD. His tomb had been the most famous and most holy pagan shrine in the ancient world for around 700 years, but then disappears completely without a trace. Around the same time, the Roman Emperor Theodorus had declared paganism to be illegal. Pagan shrines were destroyed or rebranded for Christian purposes, and around about the same time as the body of Alexander is lost from the record, the body of St. Mark the Evangelist miraculously appears.
I mean, I don't want to discuss Alexander's history too much in this video. It would just take too long, and I intend to discuss it more at length in other videos. But let's just say that the body of the world's greatest ever conqueror is important. You know, he influenced the Roman Empire, basically. You know, the Roman Empire. Those early figures in Roman history, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Nero, all of them, Caligula, they all wanted to be him. So, if you're a believer in the concept that the Romans really laid down the blueprint for Western civilization, with a little influence from the Greeks, then you might subscribe to what I'm saying. So how did Alexander's body get here? Well, that's a very interesting story. Alexander died in Babylon after creating the world's biggest empire. It was an empire around the size of the Roman Empire, and he'd built it in like a decade, basically. He'd conquered the land from Macedonia, Greece, in the northwest, down to Egypt in the south, all the way across to India. Huge stretch of land in 10 years, basically. And when he died, it was his generals all carved it up between themselves and started falling out and fighting each other. One of Alexander's generals was Ptolemy, who got Egypt. And he became essentially the king of Egypt, or the pharaoh of Egypt. But he had been just Alexander's kind of favourite bodyguard. So, what Ptolemy thought it might be an idea to own the body of Alexander the Great, because every society needs a patron saint, shall we say. So he figured if he owned Alexander's remains, it would give him more authority in Egypt and beyond, you know. So, to cut the long story short, and I'll be cutting the long story short quite a lot in this video, When they were transporting the body of Alexander back to Macedonia, the body was stolen, intercepted by Ptolemy, the forces of Ptolemy, and they basically nixed the body and took it back to Egypt. Just currently walking around this courtyard that surrounds St Mark's Square and keeping out the rain. The Doge's palace. I will be in there later, in the museum. So where was I? I believe I was cutting the story shorter. So, Ptolemy, Alexander's favourite bodyguard, becomes Ptolemy the First and creates the Ptolemy dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, a dynasty which ended about 300 years later with Cleopatra. Yeah, she was a Ptolemy. She was the last Ptolemy with that bloodline, that dynasty. Another story for another time. So, Ptolemy has his dynasty. He has Egypt. He has the body of Alexander. Consolidated his power. Things are looking good. So, all through classical antiquity, all the way to the start of the Christians, basically, 3rd, 4th century AD. The body of Alexander is on display in Alexandria. So, but then the Christians rise up. Now, Alexander was, of course, a pagan. He's a pagan figure, was worshipped as a pagan god, both in his lifetime and beyond. So, such things would potentially be desecrated when the Christians came along. So, at a certain point, the location of Alexander's body on display goes missing. Missing from the record, from the historical record, basically. At the time, all things pagan were being pulled down, destroyed, converted into, temples. Roman temples were being converted into churches. Pagan shrines desecrated, torn down. And the tomb of Alexander is lost. And some believe, and this theory believes, he may have been rebranded as St. Mark. That was standard, normal things. Pagan things became Christian things. That was a natural transition. Of course, this is all before the Muslims came along as well, so, another challenge for ancient artifacts. In terms of Venice, when Venice was founded, Venice was essentially built originally by refugees at the end of the Roman Empire, when the Germanic hordes were rampaging across the Italian peninsula. a bunch of refugees saw a few little islands dotted around in a lagoon, this lagoon, which meant they were quite safe from the marauding barbarians on horseback if they were out here in this lagoon on these little islands. And so Venice, the beginnings of Venice were started. So the early Venetians at a certain point figured, like Ptolemy before them had figured, that they needed a kind of patron saint for their city. And they decided Saint Mark would be the guy. So it's kind of 8 o'clock now, 8 a.m, and all the kiddie-winkies are rushing off to school. Walking to school past this, imagine that. Kiddie-winkies going to school unbeknownst to them that their patron saint might not actually be who they think it is. I wonder what the Venetians would think about that if they found out that their sacred Basilica housing the remains of St. Mark. And those remains weren't actually St. Mark at all, they were in fact those of Alexander. We'll never find out because the church will never allow testing to be done on the body, I'm pretty sure. We don't need testing because there are artefacts, interesting artefacts with the body. As I said earlier, those Venetian merchants smuggled the body of St. Mark out of Alexandria, but they also brought other materials with them too. Other materials and relics and artifacts. One of those artifacts was a fragment of the tomb that the body was housed in, sarcophagus. And that fragment had an emblem of the Macedonian star on it, or a section of it, which was said to have housed the body for a while in Alexandria. That sarcophagus can now be seen in the British Museum, but the lid to it, fragments of that lid, are in there now. And that is where the smoking gun is, really.
Historian Andrew Chugg notes that Alexander's famous tomb in Alexandria vanished from the historical record exactly when the Theodosian decrees outlawed paganism. Simultaneously, references to St. Mark, whose body had previously said to have been burned, suddenly appears in the same area. Chugg argues that local Christians rebranded the mummy to protect it. 2 Venetian merchants then allegedly stole the relics of St. Mark from Alexandria and brought them to Venice. Historical accounts of the Venetian relics describe the body of St. Mark as mummified, a practice consistent with Hellenistic kings, but not common for early Christian martyrs. Crucially, in 1960, a piece of Macedonian masonry was found in the foundations of St. Mark's Basilica. Chugg's research suggests this slab, featuring a Macedonian shield and 8-pointed star, is an exact mathematical fit for the sarcophagus of Nectanebo II, the very same sarcophagus said to have housed the remains of Alexander in Egypt, and which is now on display in the British Museum.
You know, for me, the theory, it's all about those artefacts that were found with the body. You can never say 100%, you never should, unless it's proved beyond doubt. I'm going to walk around this square one more time, out of the rain, and put my case forward. It's not my case. The case is out there already. You can look it up yourself. It's delicious. But I personally think it's the most delicious theory out there at the moment in terms of history. Yes, this day is going to be spent pretty much undercover for most of it, thankfully, in museums. When I was growing up, my favourite films were the old Ray Harryhausen films. You know, Clash of the Titans, you know, and Jason and the Argonauts, Sinbad, those old films, stop motion films, legendary special effects guy, Ray Harryhausen. But mostly the old Greek stories, and I was fascinated with all things Greek from an early age. So even at a young age, I was reading about the old Greek myths. And then I found out about Alexander. And like, oh, this guy was real. This isn't a myth, or it's not an ancient Greek god. This guy actually existed. You know, I'm fascinated with him. I'm fascinated with him for all the right reasons and all the wrong reasons, good and bad, you know. He was great, but he was also not great. I think it's important that we don't judge historical figures too harshly with myopic eyes in the 21st century. As Michael Woods very cleverly said about Alexander, he was a man of his time, not ours. It's not fair to judge him by our modern standards, because you could only come to one conclusion, and that was, will always be negative. And he wasn't all negative, far from it. You know, but it's complex. There's problems kind of idolising Alexander because of the war crimes. He did commit war crimes, like all conquerors, all of them. He committed some war crimes. But he was also a student of Aristotle, you know. And there was a philosopher king. And there was an enlightened side to him. Far more enlightened than some figures I can think of right now, like active right now, like Donald Trump. You know, Donald Trump seems like a heathen in comparison. And I mean that seriously. He succeeded, he did outdo the gods. He did outdo them, no question in my mind. And he also succeeded in his other quest to create a sort of early version of the United Nations. With him as the head of it, of course. But, you know. Not going to mark him down too much for that. You know, he was worshipped as a god in his lifetime, the son of a god. You know, ring any bells? That son of a god, worshipped as a son of a god. You know, did he really believe that he was the son of a god? Or did it just work for him and allow him to fulfill his political agenda? Either way, his tomb might be in there. So, obviously, because I'm so much more fascinated with Alexander than I am with St. Mark. Sorry, Christians. Being in there is quite an event for me, after spending so many years reading about Alexander. I think I've walked around this square about 3 times now. This is the last one. So I'm going to head for some shelter and dry my feet a little bit before heading into the Basilica in a couple of hours.
Basilica di San Marco, or St. Mark's Basilica, is Venice's most famous landmark, renowned as a piece of Byzantine architecture and nicknamed the Church of Gold for its 8,000 square metres of luminous gold mosaics. Originally the private chapel of the Doge, it has housed the relics of St. Mark the Evangelist since they were smuggled from Alexandria in 828 AD. The present structure is the third church begun, probably in 1063, to express Venice's growing civic consciousness and pride. Like the two earlier churches, its model was the 6th century Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, although accommodations were made to adapt the design to the limitations of the physical site and to meet the specific needs of Venetian state ceremonies. Middle Byzantine, Romanesque and Islamic influences are also evident, and Gothic elements were later incorporated. To convey the Republic's wealth and power, the original brick facades and interior walls were embellished over time with precious stones and rare marbles, primarily in the 13th century. Many of the columns, reliefs and sculptures were spoils stripped from the churches, palaces and public monuments of Constantinople as a result of the Venetians' participation in the Fourth Crusade. Among the plundered artifacts brought back to Venice from Constantinople were the 4 ancient bronze horses that were placed prominently over the entrance. Several medieval chronicles narrate the removal of St. Mark's body from Alexandria in Egypt by 2 Venetian merchants and its transfer to Venice in 828 AD. The Chronicon Venetium further recounts that the relics of St. Mark were initially placed in the corner tower of the castrum, the fortified residence of the Doge and seat of government located on the site of the present-day Doge's palace. Doge Giustiniano Participazio subsequently stipulated in his will that his widow and his younger brother and successor were to erect a church dedicated to St. Mark, wherein the relics would ultimately be housed. As the story goes, following his martyrdom in Alexandria around 68 AD, St. Mark the Evangelist was either burnt and or buried there in a church dedicated to him. And in 828 AD, fearing that Muslim authorities might desecrate the tomb, 2 Venetian merchants smuggled the body out of Egypt. According to legend, they hid the mummified remains in baskets under layers of pork to repel the Muslim customs officials. During the consecration of the current Basilica in 1094, a pillar reportedly cracked open to reveal the saint's arm and then his entire body. Venetian and Christian sources describe the remains as a mummy wrapped in linen with a strong aroma of spices, a practice not common for early Christian martyrs, but a practice certainly consistent with Hellenistic kings.
St. Mark's Basilica done, and what might have been Alexander the Great's body, sarcophagus. Each to their own.
Whether or not the body in St. Mark's is that of Alexander of Macedon, who can say, until the Church allows for a proper and comprehensive testing. Until that time arrives, I would say the odds are 50-50.
I'm now queuing up to go into the Doge's palace.
The Doge of Venice was the supreme authority and leader of the Republic of Venice for over 1,100 years, serving for life. The Doge was not an hereditary monarch or an emperor, but was essentially an elected leader and magistrate, more like a pope than a king. The Doge was a symbolic head of state and resided in the Doge's palace. Though highly influential, their power was restricted by a complex aristocratic constitution with strict ceremonial protocols, bound by promissione, a document restricting their power and limiting their privacy to prevent abuses of power. The real power in Venice lied with the Council of Ten and the oligarchical merchant families. The council was the most powerful governing body of the Republic of Venice, serving as its supreme security and intelligence agency from 1310 until the Republic's fall in 1797, when Napoleon Bonaparte conquered the city and forced the sitting Doge to abdicate. The Doge's palace is a masterpiece of Venetian Gothic architecture and was the seat of the government and residence of the Doge for nearly 1,000 years. Located in the Piazza San Marco, it is now one of Venice's most important museums. The Doge's palace was built between the 10th and the 11th centuries on the framework of an older fortified central core. This nucleus was constituted with a central body with towers in the corners, forming one of the masterpieces of Venetian Gothic. In the 12th century, the first restructuring was carried out and transformed a fort into an elegant palace. Key highlights include the golden staircase, a lavish 16th century staircase leading up to the upper floors, the institutional chambers, the grand halls where the Republic's political life occurred, including the Hall of the Great Council, one of the largest rooms in Europe, and the Bridge of Sighs, an enclosed limestone bridge connecting the palace to the prisons.
things. So we've just had a bite to eat. Pizza, in my case. Maybe the best pizza I've ever had in my life. So we are now just heading off now to the Maritime Museum. Venice, obviously one of the great maritime superpowers of all time. It would seem silly not to go and see the Maritime Museum.
The Venetian arsenal was the beating heart of the Venetian Republic's naval power. Famously described as the first large-scale industrial enterprise in history. Founded in 1104, it was the largest industrial complex in Europe before the Industrial Revolution, covering roughly 15% of Venice. Centuries before Henry Ford, the arsenal used a moving assembly line to build ships. By the 16th century, it employed up to 16,000 workers who could produce nearly one fully equipped galley per day, allowing for unprecedented speed and quality control.
Maritime Museum go, this is quite incredible. And it doesn't surprise me really, considering what a great power Venice was, and the Venetians were. Those early refugees that clung to life on those marshy islands in the lagoon obviously became quite adept with water. Not only surviving in water, but becoming incredible craftspeople in water. So we're back at the Doge's palace. After being in the Maritime Museum, the amazing Maritime Museum, and we're back at the Doge's palace because I left something in the cloakroom by accident because I'm an idiot. So that is the Bridge of Sighs, which I was walking across earlier in the day. So that's the Bridge of Sighs I've seen now, as well as the Bridge of Spies. which I saw in Berlin. Bookends.
Bucephalus. I could manage this horse, replied Alexander, better than others do. And if you do not, said Philip, what will you forfeit for your rashness? I will pay, said Alexander, the whole price of the horse. At this the whole company fell about laughing, and as soon as the wager was settled amongst them, he immediately ran to the horse, and taking hold of the bridle, turned him directly towards the sun. Having, it seems, observed he was disturbed and afraid of the motion of his own shadow, and stroking him gently, when he found him beginning to grow eager and fiery, he let forward his upper garment softly, and with one nimble leap securely mounted him. And when he was seated, by little and little drew on the bridle, and curbed him without either striking or spurring him. Presently, when he found him free from all rebelliousness, and only impatient for the course, he let him go full speed, inciting him now with a commanding voice, and urging him also with his heel. Philip and his friends looked on, at first in silence and anxiety for the result, till seeing him turn at the end of his career, and come back rejoicing and triumphing for what had been performed, they all burst out into acclamations of applause, and his father Philip, shedding tears, it is said for joy, kissed him as he came down from his horse, and in his transport said, O my son, look thee out a kingdom equal and worthy to thyself, for Macedonia is too little for thee.